canceled one because everybody was unopposed. Everybody was unopposed. It was a city council, 3 open seats, 3 candidates, and we said there's no value.
We better get started. Good morning. Welcome to a Sunday Forum. My name is Myra Starkenberg, and I'm a member of the Sunday Forum Committee. And before I introduce today's speaker, let me tell you about the questions and answers. If you are joining us online, you can go to the bottom of your screen and see the Q&A feature, and you can put your questions in there anytime during the presentation, and afterwards we will be noticing them and asking Paul to answer them. All right, if you're in the room, you can just wave your hand and we'll come with a mic. We want everything to be mic'd so that everybody can hear. And our guest this morning is Paul Huffman. He's the Minnesota League of Women Voters expert on redistricting, and he'll discuss current national trends that threaten a healthy representative democracy. And he'll let us know how we can all work together for reform. So go ahead and begin.
All right, thanks, Myra. Yes, and as Myra said, I'm the redistricting coordinator for League of Women Voters Minnesota. On this slide is my email address, and I'll repeat that at the end. So if you have any questions, or you're part of another organization, would like to hear about redistricting or get into more detail, just send me an email, phuffman@lwvmn.org, or go to the League of Women Voters Minnesota website, and you can find me there under staff. I am an unpaid volunteer staff member for the league. I've been doing this for about 3.5 years now. I retired specifically and mainly to work on redistricting because I thought it was so important to the health of our democracy. I've gotten into a few other things, and those of you who are retired, you know that when you retire, you see all these things you always wanted to do and didn't have time for, and pretty soon you don't have time for them because you're too busy. So, but this is the main thing I retired in order to work on. I am also on this, as a secondary thing, I'm a member of the board of directors of the League of Women Voters Minnesota, where I'm the co-lead for voter service. I want to start off by saying that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. We don't support or oppose any candidates or political parties at any level of government. We are always working on vital issues of concern to our members and the public. And that means, redistricting is an inherently political exercise. Parties have specific interests. They have specific positions and opinions, like many things. We take views of things that are based on studies and analysis and what's in the best interest of voters and residents. So that's where we come from, our positions. We may come into alignment or conflict with parties at various times. It doesn't mean we are partisan, just means we're principled on those issues. So as we go forward, just bear that in mind. Because I don't know what everybody's baseline understanding on redistricting is, I'll just do a real quick primer on that. Redistricting occurs every 10 years after the census. I was also part of the Minnesota Census Mobilization Partnership, which worked with a lot of community groups around the state, and part of the census table for the state to count every person in Minnesota. And the census, by our Constitution, is intended to count every person every 10 years. Every person, not every citizen, every person residing in the country, where they reside. Now, there's 3 reasons for that counting everybody. One is funding. A lot of federal funding is based on how many people are in a given area. Funding for housing, funding for services, funding for infrastructure. All that funding comes via population from the federal government. And in Minnesota, it's about $2,800 per person per year. Is based on that. So it's billions and billions of dollars, $15 billion, is what comes from the federal government for that. The second reason is strategic planning. You think about the state plans things like emergency services, roads, bridges. Companies plan on where to put manufacturing facilities, stores, so on. That's based on population. You get that mainly from the census. The third thing, what we're going to talk about today, is representation. Representation is based on population in various areas. At almost every level of government, your representation is based on population, and districts are drawn to equalize that population. So after the census, what happens is what's called apportionment that happens at the national level that determines how many representatives of Congress each state gets. Minnesota kept our 8 representatives in Congress by about 46 people. And we were actually overcounted. So, that margin has been going down over time. But it was a result of a dedicated effort by a large group of people, a lot of community groups to get everybody counted. So once that apportionment is done, it goes to the state to decide how those maps ought to be drawn. Those maps really are done based on state processes. Every state is different. They have to do some basic things the same. The districts all have to be what we call contiguous. They have to be continuous. They can't have part of it here, part of it there. They all have to be equal in population. And they have to all be such that, and this is a point of litigation right now before the Supreme Court, should provide adequate opportunity for minority groups to be represented. Now, when you look at some, as Justice Kagan has said, race is politics, especially in the South. And I grew up in the South. 80% of Blacks in places like Mississippi are Democrats. So if you say, I drew it along partisan lines, it's not racial. Well, it is race. Race is part in the South. So, that is the 3 things that basically every state has to follow. But after that, who does it, how they do it, that is really up to the state. Also, redistricting goes all the way down from Congress to our state senators and representatives, to county boards, to city councils, some school boards in Minneapolis. Minneapolis School Board has districts. The Park Board in Minneapolis has districts. There are at least 3 school districts in the state that are divided in districts. City councils, 80 or so cities in Minnesota have wards where they elect representatives in their city by district. So all of those get redrawn after the census. So this has a lot of implications on how this is done. So I just want to make sure that. So why does redistricting matter? Why should I care about this? Well, I would say that redistricting is about fair representation. You say, well, what does fair mean? And fair, you could argue that fair is kind of a subjective term. Well, fair ought to mean that those voices that are most representative of the people are those that are being heard, that no group is advantaged over any other unfairly or disproportionately. And we've seen this done historically throughout Minnesota for a variety of reasons, representing, and one that's very easy to share. Between 1913 and 1959, Minnesota did not redraw legislative districts in Minnesota. Okay, I heard a wow. Yeah, think about what's happening between 1913 and 1959. Okay, you had a lot of people moving from rural areas to cities. You had a lot of people moving from the South to the North. That's the Great Migration is in that period. So you have a lot of immigration from Europe to the United States, especially the Northern United States. So they got to the point where a vote in Northwest Minnesota is worth 10 times more than a vote in Minneapolis because they never drew the lines. So it really privileged rural interest over urban interests. And that's not necessarily a partisan thing. It's just, really gave more weight to rural interests. And that is what fairness is about, is giving equal weight to the interests that are most important to voters. So that was what I would argue fairness is. It determines what voices are being heard. It determines what policy interests are being served. Who is looking for what out of government. And those community voices are either diluted or isolated, and we sometimes call this cracking and packing in redistricting terms, may not be heard, and theirs may not be served. And we see this over history, and we see it currently in our country, places where there are gerrymandered and groups are we call packed into districts in places like Alabama, or cracked in places like Maryland. So we see this in our country. And I want to emphasize the thing about policy and not party. It's very easy to put a partisan lens on this, but it's really about policy interests. And I go back to the rural and urban in Minnesota as an example of that. Maps, because of the limited rules around maps, there's an infinite number of ways to draw a legal map. And I got this graphic And you guys can't see this.
No.
Oh, you want to get share your screen again? It must have went down.
Oh, man. Woo. Oh, yeah. You know what happened when you kicked me off, it went back on. Okay. There we go. Thank you. Yeah. Bear with me. Okay. All right. I'm all set now. Okay. So this map shows you got basically 50 precincts, 40 of them are 40%, or 20 of them are yellow, 30 of them are green. You can draw a district, in the middle there that green wins them all, but that's really not fair. You can draw one on the right where you get 5 districts where 3 are yellow, but they're really only 40% of the community. So that doesn't seem fair. You can also draw a map, and the one in the middle, so, you can also draw a map where you make, 3 green, 2 yellow, but the yellow are always going to be yellow and the green are always going to be green. And so what you end up with is safe seats. And that's essentially what we have in Congress right now, where we have almost every seat is a safe seat. There's only truly 10 competitive seats left in Congress out of 435 because of gerrymandering on both sides. The process. So people who make the decisions and draw the maps. So the people, principles process. Have you ever been in the business process stuff? You get into the people, the rules, the process. What are the steps? So this is no different. It's a process. The people is who makes the decisions and draws the maps. In Minnesota, at all levels of government, it is the elected officials who draw the maps and approve the maps. Well, who's those maps electing? It's the elected representatives who are actually approving the maps. And it was really, it was a great lesson, and it's on recording. You can see it. The Washington County commissioners, when they're debating the maps, and there was a map that was submitted that we argued for our local League of Women Voters very vocally, because it would provide greater equality of districts, provide better minority representation. It minimized splitting of cities between commissioner districts. But yet there was a county commissioner who, even though they had approved principles to support communities of interest and minority representation, all that, they said, well, we really need to do least change. We need to not do things that are too disruptive because we may get sued, which is not true. And this commissioner actually said in the meeting, he said, I really want to have this area to represent because it's got a lot of businesses in it. And I've always represented this area up here, which is really larger lots, less diverse, more affluent. I really like representing that. And it's like, he's talking about who he wants to represent and not who the people want representing them. And that's what it boils down to. And so they decide now at higher levels of government, they're much more polished and much more articulate. And so you don't get that, but it was just very, it was very obvious and very blatant in what was going on. The principles are the rules. In Minnesota, there's very little in the way of rules. Nothing says who, other than the legislature draws the maps and the legislature approves the maps, and governor can approve or veto. County boards, they draw the maps, they approve them. City councils, generally city councils review the maps and approve the maps. Some cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul, the Charter Commission does that, White Bear Lake. The good thing in Minneapolis is that the Minneapolis Charter Commission has an advisory commission that was put in place in 2010. That really helps. St. Paul does not. Charter commissions in general are appointed. They're not elected. There's no accountability to the public. And in St. Paul, the city council said, here's the principles we'd like the charter commission to use. Charter commission ignored them, just ignored the city council. And just basically what's called a lease change map that did not recognize the diversity and the changes that have happened in St. Paul over the decades. So the rules, it can be a lot more than what's required legally in order to be fair. And in the process, is there public participation, public hearings? What's the public comment on the final maps? What's the incorporation comment? So that is important. This is a map of the congressional districts on the left and the Senate districts on the right for Minnesota after the 2020 census. The blue-green represents places that were under the ideal population. So if you're going to divide up into 8 congressional districts, how many people did they need to have? The areas that are brown and the darker brown means that it is more over the ideal population. So they needed to lose population in order to get to what's required. So what that means is those greater Minnesota districts are going to have to get bigger and the urban districts have to get smaller. And that's going to happen. And so everything kind of goes like this into the metro. And then, and that's what happens. Same thing happened with the legislature. And it's really hard to see, but if you kind of go on a line from northwest to southeast, the far northwest there, that's Moorhead. And then you get St. Cloud, and then you got the metro. And then the southwest, that's Rochester. And so the urban areas are the areas that grew the fastest. And mostly when you get in the details, it's the suburbs of those urban areas. So the inner city Minneapolis didn't grow as much as the suburbs did. And then Rochester, same thing. The inner part of Rochester did not grow as much as the suburbs did. So that tells you, and this happened throughout the state. So that's what necessitates redistricting, is to make those maps equal in population, first of all, but then to ensure those other legal requirements are met. So what didn't happen? I'll start with what didn't happen in Minnesota in 2022. There's no legislation to prevent partisan gerrymandering. This is a big problem throughout the country. There have been efforts, and it will continue to be efforts to create what's called an independent commission to take that out of the hands of the legislature to draw maps. That works very well where it's in place. The legislature debated various things and it really took no action. Neither chamber actually approved maps. They heard maps. There were some that got through committee in the House, but nothing was approved by either chamber. They made no pretense. This is the third cycle in a row, 2000, 2010, 2020, where the legislature did not approve maps. So what happens if the legislature doesn't approve maps? Court's drawn. So that's how it's worked in Minnesota. And actually, if you go back for 60 years, the courts have drawn the maps for the last 60 years. Most counties were not responsive to public input. And I was telling Myra before we started that some counties are actually hostile. I mean, downright hostile, saying we don't have to do that. We can do what we want. What we're doing is legal. It's acceptable. My Washington County example, where we had a very articulate argument for why the map we had was going to be more, thank you. Was going to be more effective and better for the people. And, and that just wasn't what some of the county commissioners wanted. I mean, several commissioners just didn't want to have to run for re-election. If their district didn't change by more than 5%, they didn't have to run. One guy just didn't want to run. The other guy wanted a different district. He wanted more business. He's really tied with the Chamber of Commerce. So it got into what they want, not what was best for the voters. The city charter commission, I told you about St. Paul. They basically weren't interested. Some of the things that did happen. The state Supreme Court, we are fortunate in Minnesota to have a very good nonpartisan court system. And you can go all the way back to the Coleman-Franken recount. This was really showcased. Very balanced from a partisan standpoint, regionally, demographically. So the Supreme Court established a panel, did very good work. They adopted a set of principles that were were much more inclusive and much more beneficial and favorable to voters than what historically we've had. So, you know, that, and I'll talk a little bit about what those changes were, you know, greater consideration for representation, and some other things. Greater visibility, public engagement response. There were a lot of community groups involved in redistricting this cycle than have been in the past. And nationally, that is the case. A lot of interest in redistricting nationally. And a lot, when we talked about counties, we had more involvement in counties and then more involvement in cities. And we'll be working on that again. Some local governments did create and consider new maps or change their maps to consider for adoption. At the end of the day, they didn't actually do anything different. That's the bad part. The good part is we made some progress. We made people uncomfortable. We did make some progress. And a lot of community groups worked on maps. With the maps, the court appointed panel took public comments, a lot of comments around the state, adopted a comprehensive district principles. They specifically cited preserving Native American voting power. In particular, in northern Minnesota, the tribal areas are mostly split between CD7 and CD8. The tribal areas are split between different Senate districts, ensuring minority representation, preserving communities of interest, and they eliminated last cycle, believe it or not, they had political interest as a community of interest. Well, that's the political parties. That's not the purpose of redistricting. And so they eliminated that. And along with that, what the court did was they took out any potential consideration where incumbents live, because that was, they were allowed to use that historically as where the existing representatives live. You know, the key I would say is that these are not binding on the legislature or future courts. It's just what the court adopted. Now that could be adopted by the court later. What I said was that the principles this cycle were different than last cycle. They've continued to evolve. They did adopt the least change map because it's the law. It's legal. They're making the maps legal. They're not making the maps what's best for the residents and the voters in Minnesota. They did put all the Native American tribal areas in northern Minnesota in CD8. It did pair a lot of incumbents in the Senate and the House, and that's because they didn't look at where people lived. And that's unfortunate, but that's the way it works. They did increase majority and minority opportunity districts. The court specifically recognized, and this is one of the groups that was an intervener in the court case, that minority groups constituted the biggest component of the population increase in Minnesota. And so, I mean, we hear the same story in Texas, but Texas is taking a different response to that. But what we heard in Minnesota is that, you know, the courts recognize that because that is so important to our growth in Minnesota, the people in Minnesota, that should be recognized through representation. So we have a lot more majority, minority opportunity districts. The maps are probably a little more favorable to Republicans if you look at various analyses about partisan lean, but that goes back to least change. If you think the courts have drawn the maps, literally drawn the maps for the last 3 cycles, for the last 60 years, they've at least had their hand in the map. You've had maps that don't change much. The demographics of Minnesota have changed dramatically in the last 30 years and the last 60 years. And so those maps probably need to be different than what they are, but that's where we are. This is, and it's hard to see, this is the map of Minnesota, the congressional districts in 2012 and 2022. And what if you see the one on the right, it shows that CD8 goes way west now, has all those tribal areas in northern Minnesota, which was a real win. And I worked with the Native American community up in Bemidji, and they were very, very passionate about having shared representation in Congress. And that was a win. CD7, though, didn't have to come further south, further east. And if you think about those, all had to get bigger. CD1 down in southern Minnesota goes further up. It goes all the way up, kind of almost to the South Metro. CD8 now comes into Washington County. CD6 then moved because CD6 had to get smaller. It was kind of more of a West Metro, Northwest Metro's district now. District 5 got a little smaller. District 4 got a little smaller. District 2 becomes a little more, southern and southeastern, or southern and southwestern. So those districts all moved. And so that just shows in order to accommodate some of these interests, which the court did, and I think that's great. Is it the best map we could have? No. Is it a better map? Yes. So that's what we have from a state standpoint for Congress. Locally, some of the cities, I won't go through this in much detail. Some things that happen with redistricting principles in cities, that we did get cities to adopt principles. How much difference that made, we could debate. It does move kind of the public conversation and a precedent for what gets done in the future. In Minneapolis, something if you recall from 10 years ago, and probably most of you aren't aware, 10 years ago, 2010, the city approved the charter amendment that put an advisory commission in place for the charter commission. And the charter commission draws the maps in Minneapolis. That charter commission with the advisory commission resulted in a dramatic shift in how the districts, the ward boundaries were drawn in Minneapolis, resulted in much more diverse districts. The first Somali American council member, the first Hmong council member, the first Hispanic council member 10 years ago. So the charter in Minneapolis does require a minimal change approach. And because of the changes that happened 10 years ago, they were fairly limited changes in Minneapolis. If somebody's interested outside us, I can run through some of those. But there were changes specifically in order to preserve communities of interest. Ward 3 is around the U, and also this is escaping right now, the other college up there. And so they shrank, but it preserved that area. Ward 6, which is Elliott Park, and then other wards which are adjusted based on public feedback. So the Minneapolis City Charter Commission has been fairly responsive. And that is a picture of those ward maps, which if you take a look, shows it's largely the same as what it is, some minor changes. Two of them, wards 4 and 5, didn't change at all. But if you were to look at that in detail, you'd find various neighborhoods are preserved within those different wards. So the current state of redistricting in Minnesota. So we're going to talk about where we are. Minnesota remains vulnerable to statewide gerrymandering. And you will hear politicians, elected leaders say, everything's fine. The system works great in Minnesota. Well, there's a term when something doesn't work, but nothing bad happens. It's, now it escapes me, but normalization of deviation. Anybody ever familiar with the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster, the Challenger? Stuff didn't work right. I'm trying to remember which was the second one. I think it was Columbia. The tiles that fell off. And the first time a tile fell off the space shuttle and struck something, big root cause, ground the space shuttle, figure out what happened. Well, nothing bad happened. Then it happened again. They took some action, but not as much. They got to where it happened fairly regularly. They didn't do anything because it was like, well, this happens. Nothing bad has happened. Must be okay. Until one broke off, hit the leading edge of the wing, punched a hole in the insulation, burned through and burned up on reentry. So normally, hey, it doesn't work right, but nothing bad has happened, so it must be okay. The courts draw our maps for us, so it's okay. Well, the courts aren't supposed to draw maps for us. By our Constitution, the legislature draws the maps. So if we get to the point where either party, and I will say either party, controls the House, the Senate, and the governor's mansion, they will draw the maps to their benefit. The Democrats tried to do it in 1992, but there was a new Republican governor. And his staff was not savvy on the rules of vetoing, and they forgot to submit a veto for the map over the weekend. And so a map went into effect, and the governor went, "Holy smokes, we need to do something." So they found a technicality, took it to court. It required the legislature to make a change to this DFL legislature. They have made the change. The governor vetoed it, and then the courts drew the map. So either party is going to do that if it happens. The only defense against that is some sort of independent commission or legal constraints on how that process works. City councils in some large cities remain at large. The 8th and 9th largest cities in the state are Maple Grove and Woodbury. Neither one has wards, they're all at large. It's virtually impossible in Woodbury for a minority to get elected to city council. And I've done the map, they all live within a 1-mile radius of each other in the central part of the city. So it's kind of, is this really representative of the city? Yes, they're serving the whole city, but are they really representative? Maple Grove has got the same situation. The city and county officials are resistant to public input, and they do lease change approach. And what in Washington County, the county commissioner said, well, we're required to use lease change approach. No, you're not. That is not what the law says. You know, that is what the court does, because the court is there to make the maps legal. That is not what you're required to do. So it's an understanding of what the legal requirements are. City charters don't reflect commitments or interests of the city council. I go to St. Paul. I go to the same thing in Rochester. The city council had passed a resolution in 2018 to have an advisory commission. By the time the 2020 redistricting cycle came up last year in 2021, we said, hey, you're going to do an advisory commission. He said, well, we don't have time. So it's not in a charter. They're not held to it. So you got to change the charters. Got to change the St. Paul City charter to reflect what the city council wants, not what the charter commission wants. They're appointed to carry out the charter. Minority communities are the most interested, motivated, and impacted. In my work over the last 3 years, what I've learned is that people like me, white, well-educated, relatively affluent, redistricting really doesn't affect me. My interests are probably going to be served and supported no matter what happens. But the people who are minorities, they're more disadvantaged, more economically disadvantaged, less educated, they are probably going to be more impacted, and they are more impacted. They're also less civically engaged in general. They're less knowledgeable. And what we found is that as we get involved with those groups and those communities, they become knowledgeable, they become interested, they get into office, and they are then able to be more engaged in making that change real. Another key thing is that redistricting efforts don't stop when the maps are done. There are court cases now moving through various courts through the state U.S. Supreme Court on redistricting. There are groups active still in both parties and others on redistricting, you know, looking what they can do in the meantime. There are things that can be done in the meantime on city councils and county boards. So that work continues. Nationally, just briefly, you get two things that happen with legislatures. It's either going to be hyperpartisan gerrymandering or gridlock. That's really the options. And what happens is, the bottom line is that what I'm going to say here is that once you've been gerrymandered, you can't undo it. Wisconsin is a great example. Wisconsin is an example. Maryland is an example. Kentucky, you know, Kentucky and Maryland are my favorite example. Kentucky Republican legislature, Democratic governor. Maryland has a Democratic legislature, Republican governor. Gerrymandered legislature draws a map, approves the map. Governor vetoes, legislature writes the veto. Wisconsin Republican legislature draws an even more gerrymandered map than they did 10 years ago. The governor vetoes it, goes to the courts. The courts initially approved the governor's map, and then they approved the legislature's map. And so you're back where you started from. So, you know, it's something where people need to understand that you need to take actions like insurance before something bad happens. And divided government, nobody agrees. There are commissions, political commissions, that results in basically they blow them up. Independent commissions, there are only truly 4 independent commissions in the country: Arizona, California, Colorado, Michigan, and they're all very uneventful. Pretty fair maps, pretty good. It's hard to do, it's hard work, but very uneventful. Nationally, and I just mentioned, it's hard to change once you've been gerrymandered. There's only 10 competitive seats left in Congress. 10 years ago, that was 100. So before the 2010 cycle, more focused now, just politically, as the legislatures get gerrymandered, there's really nothing else to do there. It's going to counties, it's going to cities, going to school boards. All right, so that's where local redistricting becomes even more important. And then we're all demobilizing. So, our focus areas in the league for the next 10 years really is on local redistricting and building capacity and knowledge and support, doing things at the city level to change city redistricting, county redistricting. We were not well prepared for legal action. After the 2022 cycle, we found some opportunities to challenge some counties, but we didn't have legal representation readily identified for that. So, that's some of the things, and working toward a state constitutional amendment potentially in 2026. What we find is that the closer you get to the election, the harder it is to get something through the legislature, because they're both kind of scheming, thinking I can get all three and I can control the map. So until 2026, it's too far off the radar. After 2026, we think 2026 is kind of the sweet spot. So that's what we're aiming for. So I covered a lot of stuff. I apologize for initial bobbled air with the sharing the slides, and just open for questions.
Who appoints,
I think, is it on? He says it's on, yeah.
who appoints the charter commission?
Who appoints the charter commission? It's generally appointed by a judge who's appointed to do that. And I'm not, I know I've looked at this for Minneapolis. I think it's the head judge of the Minneapolis courts.
The school judge?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so you know who that is? It's the chief judge. Yeah, but it's the chief judge. It's the chief judge of for the city.
How many members of the charter commission?
I don't know off the top of my head. 10.
5 or 10?
Can you
10.
repeat the question? Because
Yeah. Oh, yeah. How many members on the charter commission is around 10. I mean, it's pretty typical. I want to say St. Paul's got 6.
Alex, are there any online questions? Okay, you want to do what? We'll like to alternate, to be fair.
Yeah, we've got 2 questions online. First one's from John Humphrey. He asks, please give a specific example of a minority opportunity district. How was it redrawn to give better balance? If it was redrawn in 2020, have we had a chance to see if the results changed yet? Or will this fall's election be the first chance to see if there's a significant change?
Great question. I'll answer the easy part first, which is this fall will be the first chance to see if that's had it made a difference. Because the redistricting maps were approved in February by the court. And so this will be the first election with that map. This is also a reason why every seat in the legislature and every seat in the, every seat in the House and the Senate are both on the ballot this fall, because everybody's district was changed. I can't give you a specific example off the top of my head of the districts that changed into a minority opportunity district. So I'm sorry, I can't give that specific. I just don't have that.
Another question in here. Okay.
You mentioned that there are 4 states that have this constitutional nonpartisan group. How were they able to achieve that? Do you have the history of it? And then the second part of the question is, what groups do you see combining to push for a constitutional amendment?
Thanks. Yeah. And the thing about each one of those states is they have the opportunity for an independent citizen ballot initiative. And that is the challenge, because as I've looked at this, the states where you can do that, you have an independent, it's citizen ballot initiative. Michigan was most notable there in 2018. California was very notable too, 2008. In 2000 in California, the parties got together and basically did a horse trade. They knew that Democrats were going to control the legislature, and they just say, okay, let's make sure all incumbents are safe. And so both parties incumbents in the 2002 election won by at least 19 percentage points, and the public just became pretty incensed at that. So they were at a disadvantage because we have to go through the legislature, and legislatures are very reluctant to give up their power. And so that's the battle. The closest anybody's come to getting there is Virginia, because they have a commission that's made up of half elected representatives and half citizens, but the parties blew it up. I mean, that's my phrase. I mean, basically the party sabotaged the process and ended up going to the courts. Same thing happened in New York where they have a commission. The parties, stonewalled the process. The groups working for that in Minnesota, the groups we're working with primarily Common Cause Minnesota. Kind of the division of effort we've got right now is they're really focused on the legislature and the state level. We in the League of Women Voters are more focused at the local level because that's how we're best organized. And then we support what's called the Our Maps Minnesota campaign, which is something that came together really under Minnesota Council of Foundations with a number of grantee organizations included, and I'm going to see how many I can name for these, Council of American Islamic Relations, Native American Community Development Institute, ACER, African Community Education, ACER, CAPI, COPAL, HASER, and there were Deaf Equity. There were a dozen groups that had grants that we worked with on community mapping, community engagement, testimony in order to testify. There's that coalition is expanding in order to get more community groups. And what I mentioned is it's great for League of Women Voters to be involved, but a lot of our members aren't personally impacted by redistricting. So it provides an opportunity for us to support and provide a platform for these other groups that really are impacted and are much more passionate and to be involved in that. So that's who's working on that. So I'd say at the middle of that is us, Common Cause, Minnesota Council of Foundations is a big funder and supporter of that. And then a number of other groups. Fair Maps is a part of that. Clean Elections Minnesota is a part of this alliance.
And we have another online question from John Humphrey.
Yeah.
Drawn maps. Are they more balanced? Are they nonpartisan? When were they redrawn? How long will they be in effect?
Yeah, state courts, they are equal in population. They are not drawn with the intent of being balanced from a partisan or competitive standpoint. That's not what they do. They were issued in February 15th, 2022. So about 8 months ago, they were issued, exactly 8 months ago today. They were issued, let me think here. They will be in effect for 10 years until the 2032. So by sometime in February of 2032, the new maps have to be in place either by the legislature or by the courts.
Okay.
Would ranked choice voting do anything to counteract these gerrymandered districts? I mean, would it, the safe districts, the so-called safe districts, would ranked choice voting change that in any way?
Ranked choice voting helps when you have more than two candidates. In a lot of races, you only have two candidates. CD8 only has two candidates. So ranked choice voting really doesn't help. So ranked choice voting helps when you have third and fourth party candidates or in nonpartisan races like city councils and school boards. It's a great for proportional representation is where you usually talk about ranked choice voting. And that's a whole nother kind of area. It is not, I don't think, a replacement for or a solution to gerrymandering. You get Georgia, which is heavily gerrymandered. 70% of the legislative seats are uncontested in Georgia because there's just no point. So when you have uncontested seats or two party races, ranked choice voting really doesn't help.
Okay.
We have another online question from John Humphrey. He's full of questions.
Good.
Yeah. How can we have input into the 2026 constitutional amendment?
Great. Yeah. How can you have input? And the great thing to do is once we got a lot of groundwork to lay, we got a lot of community and grassroots organizing to do to get to that point, get bills into the legislature. When we get to that point, which will be 2023, 2024, it will be to let your legislators know you support those bills around establishing independent redistricting commission. That is the thing that everybody can do, every voter can do, is to let their legislators know of their interest in ensuring that we have a process for drawing districts that does not allow any group or party to make that decision to benefit themselves and no others.
Any more questions in here? Otherwise, I have a question. So how common is it for League of Women Voters to have a person like you? Are you the only one in the country, or is this commonplace?
I think,
Because I want to say also, I'm just so grateful for what you're doing.
thanks.
So.
Thanks, Myra. I think not many state leagues have somebody who does what I do. They mostly have people who do this as secondary to whatever else they do. And so I work pretty extensively with the National League on redistricting and with them on strategy and things like that. There are others in the league and other states that are very committed to it at various levels. So yeah, it's not common. There's almost always somebody in a state that is their leader for redistricting. And some are incredibly active. I mean, there's some people that are just, and I'd say, and it's really localized. Wake County, Northern Carolina, there's a woman that I've worked with a lot. She's former, PhD in public policy for Stanford, used to be head of the public policy department at American University in Egypt. Brilliant. And they've done incredible studies and incredible work. North Carolina is a very hard place to do work. So there are people who are really dedicated to this in various places. We are very complacent in Minnesota because nothing bad has happened. You go to places like Wisconsin, Texas, North Carolina, they are doing great work and very hard work, and they're very committed to it because it's a very, very real issue for them.
Okay, well, unless there's some other burning questions, I think it's already time to leave. To end, I should say. So, get my little paper here, cheat sheet. And so, first of all, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
You learned stuff. It was good. So next week we have a thing called Rebuild Ukraine. And it is an organization that is committed to rebuilding Ukraine, of course. And they have a musical contingent. I just got an email from Philip Brunel that they will be having a performance in the sanctuary, the 11 o'clock service next week, because there's a musical contingent to this. I'm not sure. They do performances and concerts to make money, but they also have speakers. So there'll be a speaker here at 10 o'clock next Sunday promoting their Rebuilding Ukraine project. And then afterwards, there'll be a musical performance from that group in the sanctuary. So I hope